Hey, what's up guys, Diana here and welcome back to the channel. And this is going to be one of the first videos in a new series called How-Tos in the Real World. Now, this doesn't actually require me to go out in the real world and do anything, so it is more of a talking head style video, but it is going to be answering one of the big questions that I've been getting a lot via email, on Instagram, and the DMs, just all kinds of stuff. So I want to jump into my thought process and how I went through. It wasn't just like, oh, this has this feature and that one has that one as far as camera brands or camera bodies. And so I want to break that process down, and it's just really a 3-phase process, but I really want to go through and explain that. However, this new series, again, it's called How-Tos in the Real World because it's questions and answers that I'm going to be giving, or questions that you guys are giving me and answers that I'll be giving in a series where I'm actually going to not just sit here and answer the question or whatever the case is, but actually go and show you what that looks like. So if you're wondering what is the difference between like a f2.8 lens or f1.8, or does it even matter, and what that actually looks like in the real world versus just a blurry background, and kind of, you know, how I make those decisions even for myself, we're actually going to go to the History Museum and see what that looks like in a picture, in a video, or something like that. And so some of those videos are already recorded, but that's just to give you a little insight into what this new series is about. But otherwise, let's jump into this particular video. I have gotten this question a lot since especially I posted my rant video, or some of you guys like, yeah, I'm kind of feeling the limitations of my Canon M50 as well, or similar camera, or even just some other brand, and you're considering switching for some of the same reasons that I mentioned as well. But it's not just as simple as that. And again, in a rant video, I wasn't really going to break down what that process looks like, but it also gives the wrong impression, unfortunately, that it's just like, oh, in the camera body by itself, you know, without any lenses or anything else taken into account, these are the features and the things that this camera has versus that one, and that's what, you know, goes into it. And it's really not. It's a whole lot more to it. So I want to break that down, and it's going to go through the 3 things that I think through when I'm actually considering making a switch, or, you know, saying what that process was like, just especially for this one particularly. So the first question in this phase is going to be, what am I currently experiencing on my camera, and what do I want to happen instead? So a lot of the things that I was doing on the Canon M50, or just like for Canon cameras in general, are things that begin to be a hack. It's not natively or already built into the camera. So there's a ton of questions, like on those live streaming videos, for example, like how to do this and how to do that. And it's just like, guys, you have to understand, this is a hack. It's making it work, or getting your camera to the point that you can be able to do it. But understand that under a certain price point, there's always going to be limitations. And then, you know, at this particular camera, there's a whole lot more limitations. So making the hack work for you so that you can use what you have. And so I just kind of, you know, is feeling the burn of that. Like, I don't always want to have to search for a hack. Granted, at a certain price point, you come to expect it, but regardless, it's like if other brands at a price point is doing one thing, I kind of hope to expect that in my preferred brand of choice. So I wanted to stop doing hacks. That was the first thing. Next thing is, I really have a pretty demanding list of features that I ideally would like to see in a camera. And so I'm going to list those out. And the first one is reliable autofocus. That is without question. Like, yes, most of my videos are videos like this where it's kind of talking head, but I want the option. Again, I always refer back to like the TV option. It's just like, oh, saying like you don't need a remote, or you don't need some of these ports and stuff on the back, because most people may not use them. It's like, don't take options away. Let me make the decision if I want to use something or not. And reliable autofocus is just one of those things. Like, it's a given. I don't care if I do manual focus a lot or whatever. I want that to be a given. Next thing would be great lenses at reasonable prices. We'll touch on that a little bit more. 4K video, unlimited recording if possible, flip screen, built-in in-body image stabilization is a preferred option, clean HDMI out. I did not want to have to do any kind of additional hacks. And yes, I absolutely love Ecamm Live, and I'm so grateful that they made it natively built into their software that you literally just can connect the Canon M50 with a USB cord and you can use it, and then that's it. So I love that, but at the same time, if I switched brands or something like that, is that going to be, or it just upgraded the camera, I want it natively built into the camera. I don't want to have to use software if I don't want to, because in the options where if I'm at somebody else's house or something, or I'm in some other situation, I'm not using Ecamm Live, now I'd lost that feature or that hack or that ability to do that. Next thing would be a log profile, meaning I have the options and the ability to color grade if I want to. Not necessarily that I may color grade all of the videos, but if I want to start experimenting in that world, I wanted to have the option. Next thing is going to be an APS-C sensor size is preferred. I just like that. And then of course, the holy grail for anybody that wants to do video, and that is a headphone jack. It is a preferred option. It's not really something that's necessary for me, but it's something that I wanted. Now that I have like the Comica CVM AX1 that I've talked about before, the little audio device, that's honestly better than a headphone jack, but I get a headphone jack by way of that. So again, it's a preferred option. It's not something that I absolutely have to have. So knowing this in this first phase already, what cameras would that potentially put in my realm? So that would leave me with a Panasonic GH5, a Panasonic G85. I already had the G85, and I really do love Panasonic, but it's like, please just put face detection, autofocus in there. I get you're working on it, and even with the recent updates that have come out, recent firmware updates, but they're only doing that on like the GH5. That's a big camera. I'll get into that a little bit later, but it's like, reliable autofocus is just not one of their given things, and I don't want to be stuck doing manual focus. And yes, there are some people that may say that, well, just manual focus, it's not that bad, it's not that hard. No, it's not, and I've done it before, and it's fantastic. I like autofocus though. Sue me. And then it's a micro 4/3 sensor, which means it's a much smaller sensor. If you think of it in options like French fries, you have small, medium, and large. Micro 4/3 is the small, APS-C is the medium, and full frame is the large. I don't want larges all the time, and I don't want smalls all the time, aka mediums are what works for me. So that kind of puts those out. And the GH5, I've tried it when it first came out. It's too big of a camera for me. It's too heavy. I don't want it. And so that takes it out. But above all things, it has poor autofocus. The next thing would be the A7 III. It has a 30-minute recording limit, or I could get the A6400. And there are a lot of camera options if you're, again, it's like I want things like a flip screen, but I'm willing to go against that and my preferred option if the camera has most of the other features. So the A6400 doesn't have the in-body image stabilization, but I'm like, it has the flip up screen, it has pretty much everything else, but it's like, we'll put that as an option. And the A7 III having a recording limit, at this time of me looking at stuff, nearly all cameras have a 30-minute recording limit. There's only Panasonic that has the unlimited recording in video, period, whether it's 4K or 1080p, it doesn't matter. Unless you're going to go get a camcorder or maybe a film cinema camera or whatever. I don't want to do that. So at the price point that I want to spend money at, which is sub $2,000, it's really kind of hard to stuff all this stuff into these camera body options without getting into like a maybe $3,000 or $4,000, if not more, $1,000 range. I'm not doing that. So that takes Panasonic out for me. It has poor autofocus. It has to have that. That's not a preferred option. It is the option. So it's just like, no. But the Sony, I'm like, we can put those on the maybe list. The Fuji X-T3, I've tried to love that camera, and I just can't get with the manual dials on the top. Some people like it, and they like, oh, it's just like a vintage camera. Like, I don't care about that. That's not my bread and butter. And so it has questionable autofocus. Beyond that, maybe I could get used to the dials. Somewhat questionable autofocus. And again, autofocus is not an option at this point anymore for me personally. And so I'm like, nah, that's off the list because it's not working for me. But it has everything else, and they do have some weird limitations on the recording. So it's like, it's not just a 30-minute recording limit. It's sometimes like 15 minutes in 4K, unless you get a battery grip kind of stuff with the Fuji cameras. There's too much playing around, trying to remember, oh, do I have 15 minutes or do I have 30 minutes now? It's like, no, that's too much. So too many things, and then I don't like the way it feels in the hand because I did go and try these cameras out in person to get that experience for myself. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. but I'm like, I didn't like the way that it felt in the hand. You can get around that getting like grips and covers and all that, but just in genuine, it's like, it's too many things, you know, or in general, it's too many things that are just not working for me. Fuji's out. So I'm like, the Canon R, yeah, it's a more expensive camera body, not what I would want, and just crippled features everywhere you can turn. But it's like, I'm used to Canon. It's like, can I deal with it? At the end of the day, can I deal with it? I could. So it's like, put that in the maybe pile. Now you have possibly a Canon M6 Mark II that might come out. But again, it's Canon. They cripple everything. We'll still put that in the maybe pile, but probably not, because I'll probably end up having some of the same, maybe similar features, just trying to, you know, guesstimate based off of the camera's company's history and the way that they typically do stuff. I can kind of expect that one to maybe have crippling features as well. And I don't want another camera that can't have autofocus in 4K and it's like severely cropped. Like, as best as I can avoid it, I want to avoid that. Canon RP also crippled. So any Canon cameras, they're kind of like maybes, but they're also at the bottom of the list. So these are my options now. And this is what I'm able to, you know, consider. So with that being said, it's like the maybe pile is mostly Canon and Sony, or nearly all Canon and Sony, because Nikon, I was surprised by the Z6 and really impressed with it. But it wasn't, again, it's just not for me. I just didn't vibe with it. So that's the best way I could put it. So now I've had this narrowed down between the Canon R and the Sony A7 III or the A6400. So this next phase now is me going into researching the lens options. Fine. I stay with Canon and I upgrade to the Canon R, or I migrate over to Sony and I get the A6400 or the A7 III. The second part in this phase that I'm thinking through is what are going to be the lens options. Anytime I'm buying a lens or I'm considering buying a lens, I want a really good zoom lens that is a wide angle kind of a lens, and like maybe an f2.8 or lower. So like any of the 1.4s or 1.8, something like that, but at least an f2.8. I can deal with an f4, but it's like, again, options. And I want a good prime. I have designated for myself personally, I love the 35mm focal length of a prime lens on an APS-C camera. Kind of puts you at about that 50mm range on a full frame camera, but beyond any of that, I don't care about, again, how it compares to full frame and that stuff. 35 is what works for me. I really have fallen in love with that focal length. Anytime I'm using a camera, I'm always going to get the kit lens. Everybody talks trash about kit lens. They have a specific use for me, and then I just really enjoy them because they're fun to use. They don't require a lot. If you ever break one, it's easy to replace. They may be like $50 to $75. Not a big deal. But they serve the purpose in helping me to understand of the usually like the 15, it's like the 18 to 55 on most Canon DSLRs. 15 to 45 on like the M50, and then like on the Sony one that I have is the 16 to 50mm. So somewhere thereabout. And that is honestly the focal range that I would want, or somewhere thereabout, to where it's pretty wide, maybe 20 to 24 on a full frame comparison, but it gives you enough space so that if you are vlogging, it's not right up on your face, maybe like an 18 or 20mm is, but for an APS-C sensor size, you know, anywhere from like 10 to 15 or 16mm is good for a wide end. And then again, stopping at the 35, which is my favorite. So I use a kit lens to determine, is that still true for me on this camera? Am I still liking that? If there's a crop, does that mean that I need something else? And all of those things. So on a Canon camera, there's always seeming to be a crop, or at least at the time, a crop on the 4K. So I really want to consider, if there is a crop in 4K, now what kind of a lens does that mean that I need? So if that means that I need, maybe instead of a 20 or 35mm lens, I probably should be getting a 12mm prime or something like that to deal with that. Now that kind of is like, okay, that puts me at a different lens range. So I use the kit lens to really determine what focal lengths am I using most often and all of that. So that's what I do with that. So knowing this, I take this into account now, researching the lenses that I would buy if I stayed with Canon that I could use with the adapter, even with the, Viltrox speed booster and all of that, it's like, what lenses would I buy? Again, it would probably be somewhere in that 16 to 35 millimeter lens. For Canon, that would mean that I needed something that was relatively new, but not too old. Because when you get into lenses that are too old, they focus poorly, which defeats the whole thing of reliable autofocus, and they focus loudly. Again, it's like if I take this Yongnuo lens that I have over here, this kind of noise is what you don't hear because I'm using this microphone usually when I'm streaming. Now I'm not using the Canon, but you don't hear when this is refocusing because it's so far away. But if I was to vlog with a similar kind of a lens, you'd hear that noise constantly because you're using a shotgun microphone. So the lens needed to be quiet. So in Canon, that would be stepper motors or whatever, but just like essentially quiet lenses. There are older lenses like the Sigma and the Tamron that's like a 17 to 28 f2.8. It's like $300, so not bad. But they make that kind of a noise. They focus, poorly. It's constantly like hunting back and forth. Defeats the whole purpose. So those would be out. And then you have Canon's L series glass lenses that are at an f2.8. And those are $1,600 to $1,800. It's just like, again, sub $2,000 for the camera, not for the lens too. It's like, I'm fine with spending a little bit more money on a lens if it's worth it. But it's like, geez Louise, I don't really want to spend that kind of money on an older lens though too. And that's not even the lens mount that Canon is moving into the future with. This is for the EF mount. So I'm like, okay, taking that into account. There is the 16 Sigma 18 to 35 millimeter f1.8. It's like $600. Everybody raves about it on YouTube. However, when it comes to YouTube content, I have learned for the most part not to take reviews so literal. And what I mean by that is that I want to make my own decision, because anytime you're spending a few $100s to a few $1,000s on something, you really better know that this is for you or not, because I spent so much money solely going off of reviews or reviewers that, you kind of come to trust online, and then you get it in the office or, in your space, and it's like, this isn't working for me, which is why I was able to determine 35 is the focal length that really works for me versus 50. But that's after spending and wasting money buying 50 millimeter lenses. And when I, again, but that's something you just kind of learn through the process. Same thing with camera bodies. I bought the Canon T5i the first time thinking that it would be okay. Again, it's like sometimes you kind of have to make those mistakes to kind of figure out what's most important to you. Wasn't reliable autofocus. So if it didn't have dual pixel autofocus, I learned for Canon, I don't want that camera, and it's just like, it just has remained a staple for me. And it's like, it's bulky, it's DSLR. I don't recommend any DSLRs because the preamps and the camera tend to suck. And so you don't get clean audio out of them. You get this low shh noise. So these are all the things that are going into my mind. So when I'm buying something, especially like a lens, people will always say, for the most part, something is great or it's fantastic. And one of the things I never wanted to do, and anytime I was talking about stuff, and even you guys can attest to this, if you've messaged me, then you will ask me questions. Should I get this one or that one? I'll ask you very quantifiable questions. What are you using it for? How much money are you looking to spend? What are your typical things that you're doing with it? I'm not just saying, oh, get this one. This one's definitely better for sure. Because it may be overkill. Even with memory cards, it's like, sometimes it's like stuff gets recommended. It may be overkill for what your camera is even capable of recording. So I'm not about just trying to get the highest income possible online or whatever. It's not my primary source of income. So it's like that kind of stuff doesn't matter. And I would want to give that same advice to you guys that I would wish I'd had early on. That taken into account, I've learned not to buy anything like in like extreme amounts of money unless I have my hands on it for myself, unless I have for real determined that this is something that I want, but I have to decide, is this something that's really going to work for me, or am I just kind of buying somebody else's excitement? And a lot of times online, that's what happens, is you're buying somebody else's excitement, how perfect it is for their use case, and you assume this should work for me. This, if it works for them and they're getting this kind of a footage out of it, it should work for me. And a lot of times that's not what happens. So I don't want you guys to be buying stuff just because it works for me in my use cases. I'm like, really consider, how small is your room? You may not have the extra space that I have in my office to make a 35 work for you. Maybe a 20 or 22 millimeter lens is what works for you. So, whereas I'm saying 35, input that for 20 to 22 so that you can get the lens closer because you don't have a whole lot of space. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, think about those things. So that's the kind of stuff that I think about. I'm not taking just a reviewer's opinion off of something. It has to be because I got my hands on it and I'm experiencing it in some kind of a way. That's the Canon side of things. If I went into the RF lenses, those lenses start from $2,000 to $3,000. I'm not spending that kind of a money on a lens personally. Some people, big ballers, they go for it. Even, having access to the money is not a good purchase decision for me, for my use case. Now let's look at the Sony side of things. When I looked at Sony, one, they had way more third-party options. Well, I won't say way more, but they had a good amount of third-party options. And then Tamron released a 17 to 28 millimeter lens. That's $800. Sigma has one. It's like a 14 and 24. I think that's maybe $1,300 or something like that. They have the Sigma, or Sony has a 16 to 35 millimeter one that's an f4, and that can range from like $700 to $1,200. They even have an 18 to 105, longer on the end than what I would need, but size wise it's about the same, and that's for like $500 or $600. So I could work with that. And so even though it's like an f4 for the 16 to 35, I think it may be $1,300 or $1,400 for the other like f2.8. But I'm like, the Sony cameras in itself aren't that bad when it comes to the ISO or how it is in lower light situations comparative to some of the other Canon APS-C cameras. I'm not, again, allured to the full frame, so I don't really care about that. So if I want to stick with APS-C, have it be pretty good and clean in lower light situations, and I'm looking at the lens options, f4 isn't that bad. I'm not searching for background blur because I would have my prime lens, so that wouldn't be a factor in that decision. It would only be for lower light situations. Third phase is making the decision based on what I have covered thus far. So it narrows down to the Canon R, the Sony a7 III, or the Sony a6400. Size-wise, I again prefer medium-sized cameras. A6400 would fit the bill. A7 III isn't that bad, but it also has a 30-minute recording limit, and Canon cripples their cameras constantly. Least amount of camera limitations, Sony a6400. Sony is the brand that I would say of anything, they're probably not going to cripple their cameras. A7 III, again, still has a 30-minute recording limit, not bad, but again, Canon cripples everything. So that's the second thing. Number 3, likely to produce a camera that I would want to upgrade to. Absolutely would say Sony. So the clear winner for me at that point would be something like an a6400. Not because it has anything to do with anything when it comes to necessarily all of the features that are in the camera. Those become bonuses now. But if you're going to spend that kind of money on something that's, again, sub $2,000, it is worth looking into things that really matter. The features in the camera, the lenses, the prices. That's that thought process that I'm saying that I'm going through when I'm considering putting my money forward. So there are some things like where some people will say, oh, this person suggested that one. And to some extent, you kind of have to consider what you see gets produced online or something is going to be based off of somebody's experience and their expertise in what they're doing, in their recording areas and all of that. So it's that person's skill that designates that. When I'm looking at certain tech or whatever, I'm not only comparing it to the person that is really great and has a lot of reviews and blah, blah, blah. I'm comparing it to that person that's doing their unboxing for the very first time. And that they know nothing about. Now, that's why I love that guy, Camera Conspiracies, because his stuff, he has, like he'll tell you, I don't know what I'm doing. But he makes a jest of it and it's funny, but he's going through what the normal person would. And it's just like, well, why is it doing that? And I don't know what this means and all of that, versus that, cinematographer guy that may be talking about chromatic aberration, and you kind of see this, just like, what the heck are you even talking about? What are you looking at? I don't. You can zoom in 800%. And it's like, first of all, I've never zoomed into something 800% or even 400%, even 200%. It's like, what are we looking at? I have no idea what you're talking about in this review. And so taking that kind of stuff into an account, into the thought process and all of the things when you're making a decision, that's how my thought process works. And the list of things that I go through when I'm making that decision. So it was not just a simple look at the spec sheet, here's the features on a Canon one, and here's one that's on a Sony one. It wasn't that simple. It's a for real process that I'm looking through, and the prices. And I still haven't purchased a wide angle zoom lens that has a pretty good aperture. Like I said, maybe an f2.8, but I'm thinking I probably will get an f4 one, because again, I'm not searching for a background blur for that lens per se, but I would like to have it as an option. So if you get into a situation where, like, I was recording for a Rams event and it's just like all of that, yeah, I have times where I could default to the prime lens, which is what I primarily used at that event. But at the same time, having the option to have a really good zoom, wide angle zoom lens that can get down to pretty close in the aperture space as well. So hopefully this intensive breakdown of this thought process is something that kind of helps you out in making that decision for yourself, something to consider, because when you're getting into some of these better cameras, you're getting into higher bit rates and all of this stuff, it sounds really cute and looks really good on YouTube, but then you also have to consider, can your computer handle all of that? Do you have the software that can handle all of that? And do you own memory cards that can handle all of that? So, and then accessories, for that thing and everything. So that's my thought process into going into switching. So I hope this video helped you out. And if you have any suggestions that you want featured in the how-to in the real world, make sure you leave those comments down below, because they will be added to the list. And so some of these videos, again, are already recorded, but I'll see you on the next one. Peace.